okay, trade a year into Brexit, thinking I'm not quite sure what that means or what I'll say, but we'll do something around that. And there really is a lot we could talk about. We can talk about numbers. We could spend a long time talking about numbers, or we could talk about Northern Ireland, or we could talk about COVID. But you'll get long COVID and long Brexit next time. Ukraine. We could talk about Australia and New Zealand free trade agreements. We could talk about so much. And actually, there's a serious point there that the simple certainties of Brexit for the UK government, we leave and become world leading, are really quite facile, but also damaging to the economy, businesses, workers, when considering just the sheer complexity of Brexit, the sheer complexity of modern trade. Only today we have the announcement of delayed import checks for the fourth time, ostensibly because it would be too damaging to put barriers into trade between the EU and the UK at this point in time. And my mind went back to I'm just about old enough, but I read up on it. My mind went back to the 1980s, and Mrs. Thatcher saying that barriers to trade weren't a good idea between Europe and the UK, and then we had the single market. So anyway, we're learning slowly perhaps about trade barriers again. Possibly the real reason was there were just too many problems for the UK government to try to overcome with regard to putting in place these import checks. Now, what applies to government, the fact that they're dealing with a rather more complex Brexit than they hoped to be dealing with, also applies to the likes of me talking. It would be really nice to show one definitive picture that puts everything on and shows exactly what has happened to UK trade figures and proves beyond all doubt that Brexit is having a certain effect. It's not actually that straightforward, given the need for comparators, given that COVID came in the way. Reliable data on goods and services, the data is actually not quite consistent between that is being put out by various EU countries and the UK. The UK has changed our methodology. We can see the broad trend, and that's what I'm going to talk about. I'm going to talk about various broad trends and impacts of trade barriers. I'm not going to talk about exact measures and exactly what's happened to trade. The numbers are still settling, but I think we can see what's happening, and it's roughly in line with what we thought would happen. So the issues of post-Brexit trade can actually be rather sprawling. We talk about a number of different things. So I thought what I'm actually going to do today is I'm going to go for the modern list form, 10 things we've learned about UK trade since Brexit, in order to satisfactorily cover all the ground that we need to talk about. Make sense of what's happening in, I hope, no more than about 20 minutes to allow plenty of time for me to be quizzed and roasted on various of this. And it won't surprise you that of those 10, rather a large number, I'm afraid, are not going to be positive. So let's kick off with the 10 items, I think, that we've learnt. And number one, already previewed this, modern trade is far more complex than the government's approach to Brexit allows. So earlier this week, it was suggested that part of the answer to the country's cost of living problems was tariff cuts on food. And previously, we've heard that the UK will make great gains of growing our exports to Australia, perhaps by 50% as a result of tariff cuts. Well, perhaps that was true in 1850, that tariffs were a great part of the costs of food, but it isn't true now. I looked up an old report from, not too old, 3 or 4 years old, from the Agriculture and Horticulture Development Board, in which the cost of raw materials was no more than 10% of the actual cost we pay of food. We don't in fact pay high tariffs on our food. We have a large number of agreements that allow a large number of suppliers to provide to us free of duty. And at best, if you reduce tariffs to everyone, maybe the production will shift to a slightly cheaper producer. It won't reduce costs by 50%. It won't reduce them by 5%, almost certainly. It'll reduce them by small fragments, because that's how the complexities of modern trade work. And you know, and it may even help, end UK production of food by eliminating our tariffs, because that small percentage could be enough to put UK farmers out of business and actually cost the country. Those are the kind of difficult decisions we face. What should we do about tariffs in a way that balances food prices with domestic production and food security? Just saying, oh, we can reduce tariffs and that will make a huge difference to cost of living, it's just an outright far too simplistic and no basis to run the country. Another example came last week. Jacob Rees-Mogg said, we don't care about EU regulations. Well, he may not care, or the UK government may not care, but businesses in the UK care, as in fact businesses across the world care, because EU regulations are a global reference point. And to say we don't care is just, it's ridiculous. But it is, I think, what they really believe. We keep talking about diverging from EU regulations on data, for example, or people do. But we don't, in fact, and haven't diverged, because we need the data adequacy. Businesses want to be able to transfer data to the EU. And on regulation as a whole, on divergence, businesses just can't believe the lack of support they've been getting from government on the issue. I'm afraid the list could go on. I'm just going to give a couple more examples. The free trade agreements that ministers are saying are such a triumph, but they do little for services, which is the UK's strong area. It's a free trade agreement with the EU that we replaced our EU single market with, and that has meant a lot of new barriers. So let's not overpraise free trade agreements. They don't do that much. They're helpful, but they don't do a huge amount. And then, of course, Northern Ireland, and the failure of the UK government to suggest any serious alternative to the EU opening up their borders, because they're not coping with the realities of borders being caused by differing regulations. To be fair to a lot of government officials, I think they're increasingly aware of the problems, but they're not getting much support from their ministers in managing all the different interlinkages. And I think there's a lot more to come on this. But essentially, issue number one, complex world, simplistic government. Number two, when I think about trade, the big point on the numbers, our trade with the EU is clearly being affected by the new relationship, and any gains in global trade are not making up for it. It's a simple equation in trade economics. Greater barriers mean less trade and worse economic performance. And that always seemed likely to be the outcome from Brexit. We are putting up barriers. We chose a pretty thin free trade agreement. Even a fat free trade agreement would have been a lot of barriers compared to where we started. All predictions were that would hamper trade. Those predictions, by and large, are coming true. Now, last year in 2021, global trade was up. The world recovered from the COVID economic shock of 2020. Exports recovered to 2019 levels, by and large. Well, certainly they did in the EU for goods, but not in the UK. Exports have not recovered to 2019 levels in 2021. Now, services may still continue to be particularly badly hit by COVID even in 2021. So, as with many things, we have to be a little bit provisional about the way we think about this data. But it's pretty clear that UK trade has been suffering. The Office of Budget Responsibility has been talking about a productivity loss, an overall GDP loss of about 4%. The think tank Centre for European Reform has got a model where they create a UK as would have been the case if we'd stayed in the EU, in which goods trade in their pretend EU is 15% higher than in the real UK. where exports are flat, as I said. Our EU trade partners are reporting higher trade with all their partners except for the UK. There are plenty of stories of companies moving operations to the EU, to serve the EU. Among this week's studies were one showing a dramatic fall in SME exports to the EU. The trend is clear. The data may be a little bit noisy and not always consistent. I've not got any charts to dig out the detailed numbers, but we are where we expected to be. Trade is falling. Our exports are falling. We are going to lose on GDP compared to where we would have been. And there's no serious suggestion we're going to make up for that. That deep integration we had with the rich markets on our doorstep, with shallow trade agreements with rather more distant countries. Again, the figures are just projections, but between Australia and New Zealand, at the most optimistic, you might get 0.1% of GDP gain, which set against the 4% loss, that's what 1/40th, and that is actually optimistic. I suspect the 4% could turn out to be an underestimate and the 0.1% an overestimate. So, in other words, we're suffering and the global trade deals are not making up for it. I mean, they're better than nothing, but they're not going to be a huge offset. So that's all doom and gloom, but I don't want to be, it's not entirely doom and gloom. The UK economy is not going to completely fall off a cliff, and the reason comes to number 3 of what we've learned. Major businesses continue to operate and have been less affected. And here we're talking about large companies, and they could be goods produced, they could be services. It can be the English Premier League as much as it's JCB or Rolls-Royce. It can be the Scotch Whisky Association, Formula One, Oxford University, the BBC. We have a large number of large organisations that trade quite successfully. We'll continue to export. We are continuing to export salmon and whisky, high-performance cars, but perhaps not so many mass-market cars. So that continues, and that's a lot of trade. A lot of trade is made up for by large organisations. Perhaps as much as 80% of global trade takes place, but within supply chains run by major organisations. So that limits the amount of immediate damage there's going to be. They don't make necessarily quick decisions to change their operations, although when they do make decisions to move production, it can be awfully difficult to get it back again. And that is one problem, if they may make those decisions. Another problem is that there's far less dynamism of potential companies behind them to keep them on their toes if you have problems with barriers and fewer small and medium enterprises, and we'll come back to that. Also, the large companies potentially have quite a lot of influence on the government if the government is basically desperate to see them stay in the country. We may well be losing some of our contribution of smaller companies who are feeding supply chains across Europe as a result of the higher trade barriers. And that will be one reason why, in fact, goods exports to the EU have been pretty flat since 2018. So we're gradually being written out of that picture, and that is damaging. Another small optimistic point: some good things are still happening in the UK economy, but just not enough of them. So there's still economic activity. There's still many people working incredibly hard in a number of different UK areas. Where our successful sectors right now? Film production and TV production. We've been doing tremendously well with companies coming here to make their films and TV. Fintech has been getting a large amount of investment. Pharmaceuticals make some relation to COVID. It's possible that exports of other goods dropped and exports of pharmaceuticals made up some of the losses, because obviously COVID vaccines and ingredients were a whole new area of trade last year. We're still good at various services. And And there's a couple of positives that perhaps comes as a slight surprise to people. Other countries do want to do business with the UK. It's not just because they've seen that we gave away lots to Australia and New Zealand in trade deals, so they think we're an easy touch. We're still a large trade player, so countries want to do business with us. And I think the one thing I'd say is the most positive part of the story of the last 15 months has been that actually we haven't put the drawbridge up as much as people feared on immigration, certainly skilled immigration. The generous response on Hong Kong will bring in a lot of people. There is also signs that migration from the rest of the world is making up for less coming in from the EU. Clearly, you've got to mention the Rwanda plan. Whether that ever actually comes to any fruition is not good, but there are some positive signs. It's not the same as a regular flow that we used to have of labour between the EU and the UK, but it's not as bad as we feared. And migration can be quite important for the functioning of the labour market. So a couple of not so bad things, though. Coming back to things that are problematic, the fifth of the things we've learned: small business is suffering most. I think that's really pretty clear, and you can use immigration as part of that story. Small businesses used to have equal access to labour from the EU as larger businesses. Everybody was in that together, but now small business has to go through the same process as large business. They're not going to be able to do that. Larger businesses will have the dedicated HR function to be able to go through home office processes. Small businesses won't. And that will crop up in all sorts of ways. Small business are finding it more difficult to export. They have higher costs per unit of production for exports as compared to larger businesses. And we're already seeing the number of SME exporters declining. And that's not surprising, because typically in global trade, the share of exports from large companies is maybe around 70%. But for exports between EU member states, it's actually around 60%. So that's a 10-percentage point difference. And a lot of that comes from the difference between a single market and the barriers you get outside of a single market. That's going to affect UK companies. It might not make a big difference to export numbers, but it will mean a less vibrant market domestically, less competitiveness. Moving on to the next of the 10 things, there really is no comparison between a single market and a free trade agreement. Just ask Australia, because it's quite interesting that we choose to do trade agreements first with Australia and New Zealand, who have a single market between them. It's not as sophisticated as the EU single market, but they have a single market. They didn't give up their single market to have a trade deal with the UK. And given the all-pervasive nature of regulations on anything you sell, from services to goods, the crucial issue is that in a single market where you align regulations, you can trade with few barriers. A free trade agreement, that's just not the case. You still have all of the barriers of product checks or following different regulations, whatever it is. And it leaves a complex infrastructure that the small businesses struggle to navigate. It also clearly matters to movement of people. Having said that we've been quite generous on immigration, it's still very different from the idea of a flow of people who are able to respond at short notice when we need, for example, more lorry drivers. And obviously, nobody really expected COVID to hit at the same time as with withdrawing freedom of movement, but it's clearly made a big difference. At the same time, it hasn't noticeably increased wage levels. People keep an eye on that, and the claims that there would be higher wages have not yet really been borne out. So being outside of the single market also means that for UK companies, UK-based companies, all their competitor companies based in the EU, or indeed the EU single market, all have better access to European markets than UK companies do. So that's a huge competitive disadvantage for the UK. All our neighbours have better access. That's really difficult to get over that. Other things about leaving leaving a single market that people might soon be finding out is about the difficulties of movement as holidays return. We're seeing the queues, but it's not just about the queues. It's about perhaps the small services companies who can no longer send people to work across Europe, perhaps in servicing particular equipment. And again, that will lead to businesses choosing to relocate away from the UK. Next point, slightly broader than trade. The UK is not a great destination anymore for inward investment. Now, inward investment figures are tricky to interpret. In particular, don't necessarily discriminate between greenfield new developments or brownfield buying from somebody else, whether they're actually generating exports or not. What we really, of course, want is the equivalent of lots of Nissans from the 1980s coming in, setting up a whole new factory that is exporting around Europe. Well, we're not really seeing that. And when we look at the big announcements, well, they're going elsewhere. They're going into the EU. So a couple of examples. The first cars have been starting to be produced by the Tesla plant in Germany. There was a talk some years ago of trying to attract that to the UK. It didn't happen. Indeed, delivery of gigafactories, the plants that make car batteries, looks like it's pretty well behind that in the EU. Intel are expanding throughout Europe as microchips become a major issue about supply chains because there has been a shortage, but they're not expanding in the UK. We are getting some inward investment in fintech, for example. That's holding the figures up to a great degree, but it's not entirely clear how much that's actually going to contribute towards exports, or how much it's almost as a kind of research and development fund to see whether UK companies can come up with something good, which would then go to other markets without necessarily being an export. Generally, we do seem to be falling behind on inward investment, and as I say, really no sign of the new plants that are going to come for the 2020s, and even in services, it's not really clear where the big new growth areas are coming that the investment is going in now. 3 more to go. Number 8 in my list of 10. We're not going to find a model of regulation that's going to make us world beating. We so often hear from those most strongly supporting Brexit in the government that we'll get this inward investment when we find this unique UK model of regulation that's world beating. And I got kind of bad news on that, because if it had existed, not only would we have found it by now, but actually others would have copied us as well. Because the task is so improbable, we have to assume that the UK is uniquely gifted, or perhaps other countries uniquely dumb, that they can't find a model of regulation and we can, that guarantees economic growth. And then that companies based in the UK can use our wonderful new regulations but not be harmed by the fact that there are different regulations in other countries. And then that other countries then don't go and copy those regulations because they fear how well the UK is going to do. None of that's going to happen. It just fails any rational test. And then there's an alternative idea that we just deregulate everything domestically, or we allow everybody's products in here into the UK without checking. That could have some economic effect, but it is in no way feasible that the MPs and the publics stop wanting regulation, decide that actually unsafe products and environment destroying products is really what they want. That's not going to happen either. And even if it did, again, companies would still have to meet the regulations of others. So regulations can have economic consequences, but there's no evidence I've seen that any country has ever used regulation in such a way as to increase growth rates. And it doesn't seem likely that it's going to start to happen now. In all likelihood, will be pretty similar in terms of regulation to every other developed country. I think this comes back to an idea that was had before 2016, that only Brussels regulates, only the EU regulates. In which case, some of these people should go to the US and find out how much they regulate, both at federal and state level. Last couple. Deglobalization is not going to save us. I'm afraid not only is deregulation not going to save us, deglobalization is not going to save us. So there's an idea that sometimes one hears that Brexit came at the right time because globalization is over, production is returning to local bases, and the UK will be well placed to do that. Problem is, we declared the end of globalization over COVID, and then vaccines were developed globally and made globally, and so globalization didn't come to an end. Now, for sure, Russia has written itself out of the global economy, and companies are concerned about what might happen with China and how they might in the future serve the US and China. But political risk is not a new issue. Companies will still want to search globally for the best and cheapest components. Resilience isn't that new. It might have increased in priority. Some items, there is the technology now to make some items closer to consumer basis, but in the case of the UK, I don't see why that wouldn't still be countries like Poland, which have already been doing very well anyway. And this underestimates how much of local consumption comes from local production. Certainly in terms of consumer items, consumer non-electricals, a lot of it is still produced fairly locally. So deglobalization is not going to save us, and a lot of these end of trade stories typically talk only about goods trade anyway. China, the EU, and the US all want to make more in their own markets. Services trade, as far as we can see, is still growing, and that we're affected by barriers. But on the other hand, services trade still growing does at least give us a small opportunity. And this is where I conclude and finish off by saying number 10 of trade a year on after Brexit. There's no magic one solution, but there are a series of incremental steps that are actually quite obvious, that pretty much any of the analysts who look at this will all say a similar thing. I was watching yesterday at a conference, Adam Posen, who's been quite outspoken before, former member of the Monetary Policy Committee, now head of a think tank in the US. What he said is what a number of people have been saying, that for all that the effects of putting up trade barriers have been fairly obvious, of failing to understand the complexities of the modern economy, so the solutions are relatively straightforward, if not likely to magically transform everything overnight. We're very good at services, so let's prioritize services a little more, which means visa deals with the EU rather than free trade agreements and visa deals with Australia. Greater focus than just free trade agreements reducing tariffs by a bit. Gravity matters in trade, so stop threatening trade wars and pointless regulatory divergence with the EU. Give business a stable environment, and behave like a country that understands trade. Be a little more open to trade than the EU, a little more careful perhaps in regulation, and you will actually get some kind of response there. Be open to, as much as we can be, the best talent and investment. A food and drink agreement, which can facilitate trade in that area where the barriers are highest. And of course, don't keep refighting the referendum. But one senses that this desire on the part of the government to keep proving that it was right to leave is going to outweigh those kind of pragmatic steps. I think the government wants the victimhood, the permanent conflict, and that will cost us, but big companies will help to offset the cost because they will be less affected. So concluding, really, UK trade is falling. It is having an impact on GDP. It's not clear where there's a growth plan, and the story of UK trade a year after Brexit really is setting the scene for impaired growth unless there's a change of course. Sorry, that's a little bit gloomy, but I don't suppose you expected very much different to that level of gloom. And with that, I will invite some hopefully not too difficult questions and comments and thoughts from you.
Thank you, David. Could I just ask you your opinion? If this government scraps the Northern Ireland Protocol, which there have been rumours about them making it legal for them to do that, do you think the EU will respond in a very punitive way, or do you feel that's outside your particular expertise?
I think it's a certainty if the UK responds, and I think it's already having an effect, as I suggested. The more in which you risk a trade war, it already has an effect now on putting off potential investment in particular. It creates instability politically, but also economically. And the EU is not suddenly, you often see these suggestions that the EU would be less united about responding to the UK, and it's not the case. I'm afraid the EU would respond harshly to the UK, as would, I'm afraid, the US. And yes, I couldn't say exactly what they would do. They'll keep those plans close to their chest. But if in a sense, it's the threat of them that is almost as bad. My hope is at best that perhaps the UK government aiming to pass legislation, more months tick by, in which they're not actually breaking the protocol, they're just threatening to do so. So it's possibly more performance than reality, but it's all getting a bit tedious, isn't it, really? All of this, rather than trying to fix it. I didn't mention Northern Ireland very much. It's clearly in a different position. I don't fully buy the best of both worlds argument in which Northern Ireland can have full access to both markets. That's always going to be tricky, but certainly it can have advantages. And I've been contacted by manufacturers who think that being based in Northern Ireland could be an advantage. So you can have a better process and a more constructive one, but I'm afraid the government is not finding that at the moment, not really seeking it either.